So, you're learning how to squat, and everybody and their mom is telling you what to do. Keep your heels down, keep your back straight, push your knees out, tighten your core. I think people like to give advice because it makes them feel like the authority and it feels like they're helping out. But there's so many things to remember, it becomes overwhelming and it's counterproductive. Plus, people like to make a big deal about things that really don't matter as much as they would like to lead on. Trainers sometimes don't feel helpful unless they're correcting things, even though there's nothing to correct. In this video, I want to address some common cues that you might hear when you're learning to squat, why people give them, and if they have any value. Hopefully this will be helpful if you feel like there's way too many things to remember when you're learning how to squat. I'll put a timestamp in the description below with particular cues that I'm referencing at that time. Keep your heels down or put your weight in your heel. First things first, when you're squatting, you want a strong, stable base. If you lift your heels off the ground, you have a much smaller base to work with and you're more likely to wobble or lose balance. People tend to lift their heels off the ground if they feel like they need an upright torso when squatting. And we'll get into this later, but this is not true. Keep your heels down is a decent cue, but put your weight in your heels is not. Your weight wants to be halfway between your toes and your heels, somewhere right around here. If your weight was in your heels, you're more likely to fall all the way backwards and that would suck. If your heel is on the floor and your weight is centralized in the middle of your foot, you're pretty much doing it correctly and most other things are gonna fall into place right from here. Keep your back straight or have a proud chest or show your chest. Straight does not mean upright. If a trainer is telling you to keep an upright back, get a new trainer. In a squat, you're inherently going to lean forward from the hips, and that's going to deviate from a complete upright torso. There are some people that can squat all the way down with a completely upright torso, but they have incredible ankle flexibility or their heels are coming off the ground. Either way, it's not a requirement for a proper squat. When people say keep your back straight, they mean keep it in a straight line. Cues like proud chest, show your chest, keep your chest up, those facilitate a hyperextended back. This can cause a lot of unnecessary stress on your intervertebral disc and your lumbar spine, especially under load. Instead, don't be afraid to lean forward when you're squatting, but keep a nice straight back. Try to watch yourself in a mirror with no weight squatting to see what it feels like to keep a straight line between your tailbone all the way through your cervical spine to the top of your head. It also is worth noting that a normal, healthy spine is not completely straight. It does have some natural curves in it. But for the sake of this video, we're going to use neutral spine and straight spine synonymously. Keep your head up. Trainers tend to give this cue if they feel like the participant is rounding their cervical spine or the upper portion of their back. I'm sure we can all agree that having a rounded back at any position of the spine under load of the bar is probably not a good thing. However, having the spine curved the other way is also not the best. Cueing someone to keep their head up might facilitate them hyperextending their cervical spine. Ideally, you don't want to pick a spot in front of you and keep your eyes on it the entire time as you go up and down. Instead, think about looking where is natural. If you're naturally leaning forward as you squat, your gaze wants to travel with you as well. As you squat down, don't be afraid to look down, but don't stare at your feet. And don't look completely up at the sky. Whatever you used to do before somebody made a big deal about where you're looking is probably the correct posture. Push your knees apart or pretend you're standing on a piece of paper and try to tear it with your feet. Traditional trainers give this cue because they see their participants' knees caving in, or this is a valgus position. Because your knee is only meant to go in one plane, forward and back, going in is probably going to put a lot of stress on the inside ligaments and tendons of your knee. Generally, this tends to happen with women more so than men, mostly because relative to size, women have bigger hips, which makes their cue angle bigger. Your cue angle is the angle from your hip all the way to when your knee naturally supports your body when walking. When we walk, we don't walk with our feet hip width apart. We walk pretty much foot over foot in a straight line. And the distance between the hip and where that knee supports you, the bigger your hips are, the greater that angle. You'll understand what I'm saying when you stand up and you try to keep your feet hip width apart. Let's say they're 2 feet apart. Try to walk forward while keeping your feet always 2 feet apart from each other. So each individual foot is going to follow a parallel line to each other. You're going to start to waddle. We don't walk like this. We walk together in a straight line. And because we move our feet towards each other, that's what creates the Q angle. Now men, imagine if you had bigger hips, that distance from where your feet were hip width apart to where they're going to be to support you is going to be bigger, and women have to carry that burden. Which makes this cue applicable to women and really anybody that has a knock-knee position when they're squatting. So telling somebody to push their knees out is actually a pretty good cue if you're knock-kneed. You want to try to make sure that the knees are pointing in the same direction as the toes. However, sometimes trainers give this cue because they want to see the knees pointing in a direction that's outside of where their toes are. I really don't understand why trainers want to see that. But if I were to guess, I think it's because of this book, Becoming a Supple Leopard. I read this book and I get what it's trying to say about torsion and activating your glute medius. But from a physics standpoint, if you want something to go up, you don't push out to the side. In any sense, pushing your knees outside of the plane of your toes places stress on the opposite ligaments and tendons. And it becomes less energy efficient and less mechanically efficient. If your knees are pointing in the same direction as your toes, that's exactly where it needs to be. Send your hips back. This cue is typically given if the participant's weight is too far forward. That is to say, it's not in the middle of your foot, but it's more towards the front. Or they're not leaning forward enough, which means their weight is towards the back. I like this cue. I really have no problem with it, other than the magnitude of what some people will interpret it as. If you say send your hips back, I'm thinking send it, like bring them all the way back to have an excessive forward lean, which really you don't want. What I tend to say instead is don't be afraid to lean a little forward. It's a little gentler, but it's up to individual interpretation. Some person could respond better to send your hips back, and another person could respond better to don't be afraid to lean a little forward. As long as they're not falling over, use which one you want. Don't let your knees come past your toes, or don't let your knees break the plane of your toes. This is an outdated cue. Evidence suggests that patellar compressive forces kind of skyrocket at anything beyond 90 degrees in knee flexion. And if your knees come past your toes, that's typically at or beyond 90 degrees in knee flexion. And this is thought to increase your risk for injury. However, when you tell somebody not to bring their knees beyond their toes, they just end up leaning forward an excessive amount. This is because when you lower your hips, your knees have to move forward to make way for your hips in order to keep your weight in the middle of your foot. So you end up doing a modified Romanian deadlift, and this increases the torque of the lumbar spine because you're hinging from the hips an excessive amount. I would completely ignore the cue of don't let your knees go beyond the toes unless you're doing some sort of therapy or rehab, or your doctor told you to, although doctors aren't fitness experts, unless they are. Also, having your knees go beyond the toes may not be bad for everyone. Yeah, it might be bad for somebody who has a high risk for knee injury, but for otherwise healthy individuals, exercise inherently is dangerous. You assume some risk when you exercise to reap the benefits, so it's a reward versus risk analysis. So if the rewards outweigh the risk for this position for you, then it might be fine. I'm thinking of a catcher or an Olympic lifter or somebody who frequently has this position in their daily life for some reason. But you should always talk to your physical therapist or your medical provider for more information. Contract your core. Trainers give this cue because your core, all the muscles in your core, are contracted to brace during a squat. The thing is though, your core is already braced when doing a squat, regardless of what they told you to do. It can't not be. If your core wasn't braced, there would be nothing to transfer the energy coming from your legs, going through your torso up to the bar to push the bar up. And then the bar would just crush you. Telling someone to contract their core during a squat is like your mom telling you to do the dishes when you're already doing the dishes. Squeeze your glutes at the top. There's probably a fair amount of ways to justify this cue, but none of them are right. So when you squeeze your glutes, you feel it there, and you conclude you're doing it right because you feel it. I made a video about how feeling it in the area may not always mean you're doing it right, which is right there. But the quick summary of it is, I can squeeze my butt all day long and feel it there, but why would I need a squat rack or a weight, or why spend all that money in a gym membership? When squatting, because of torque, in exercise we call it moments, but the bottom of the lift is where your glutes are working the most. They're doing the most to overcome the resistance that you're working with. And on the other hand, at the top of the lift, your glutes are not doing too much. relative to what they're doing at the bottom. Torque is force times the moment arm, or the distance from the fulcrum. In the bottom part of the squat, the moment arm is the distance between the center line, or the center of your foot, and where your glutes insert, or the top part of your femur. So whatever weight is on you is multiplied by that distance. In the top part, same deal, but that distance is much shorter, therefore the torque is much smaller. And your glutes aren't working to overcome as much resistance relative to what they did at the bottom. I get there's an argument for the mind-muscle connection and the argument of if you feel it in a favorable area, you're more likely to adhere to your program. But at the same time, there's risks. When you squeeze your glutes, you posteriorly tilt your pelvis, which could cause excessive lumbar flexion. And the same deal, under load, it could really stress out those intervertebral discs. I just don't see the benefits, if any, large enough to justify this cue in really any scenario. All in all, there are 3 big cues that you need to think of. Keeping the weight in the center of your foot, making sure your back is straight, not upright, and looking where it's natural, and keeping your knees pointing in the same direction as your toes. If you follow all 3, you're doing the squat 95% correctly. When you over-cue, the participant gets disheartened, thinking, oh, I'll never be perfect and I'm not good enough, but they're there, you're doing great. So please let me know if you know of any other cues that you hear, and I'll adjust them in another video. And consider subscribing if you want more long drawn out explanations of seemingly simple fitness questions. Thank you and good luck.